Most people who saw Marcus Steele Brennan walk into a room assumed they knew exactly what kind of man he was. 6'4", 250 pounds of leather and muscle, with a beard like iron wool and hands scarred from rebuilding engines in gravel parking lots. They saw the Hells Angels patch stitched across his back and decided the story ended there. But on a cold October morning in a roadside park outside Riverside, Montana, Steele was about to discover that the most important conversations don't always happen in loud bars or on roaring highways. Sometimes they happen on a quiet bench, between two men who've both learned that the hardest part of living isn't surviving the miles. It's surviving what comes after. The story began 3 weeks earlier, when Steele first noticed the old man. Steele had pulled off Highway 12 just after dawn, his Harley rumbling into the gravel lot beside Riverside Park, a forgotten patch of grass and picnic tables that most travelers passed without a second glance. He'd been riding since midnight, heading north toward Missoula for a club meeting, and his back ached from the cold wind that had chased him through the mountain pass. The park was empty except for one figure, an elderly man sitting alone on a wooden bench facing the river, his shoulders slightly hunched beneath a gray wool coat, his hands resting on the knob of a wooden cane planted between his feet. Steele barely noticed him that first morning. He just needed coffee and 10 minutes off the bike before his spine turned to rust. But the second morning, riding back through Riverside on his return trip, Steele saw the man again. Same bench, same posture, same early hour when the world was still waking up. The third time Steele came through town, a week later, hauling parts for a brother's bike, the old man was there again. And this time Steele slowed as he passed, something in the man's stillness catching his attention like a hook he couldn't shake. By the fourth visit, Steele couldn't ignore it anymore. He pulled his bike into the lot just after sunrise, the engine's growl fading into the quiet morning air. Frost clung to the grass, and his breath misted as he swung off the Harley and stood there for a moment, studying the figure on the bench. The man hadn't moved, didn't even turn his head. Steele walked slowly across the park, his boots crunching over the gravel path, and stopped a few feet away. "Morning," Steele said, his voice rougher than he intended. The old man glanced up. His face was weathered, deeply lined, with pale blue eyes that looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He nodded once. "Morning." Steele hesitated, then gestured toward the bench. "Mind if I sit?" "Free country." Steele lowered himself onto the far end of the bench, the wood creaking slightly under his weight. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The river moved quietly beyond the trees, and a crow called from somewhere upstream. Finally, Steele broke the silence. "I've seen you here before. Every time I ride through." The old man didn't answer right away. He just stared at the water, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he said eventually. "I'm here most mornings." Steele nodded slowly. "You waiting for someone?" The old man's jaw tightened slightly, and for a second Steele thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, very quietly, "You could say that." There was something in those words, something heavy and unfinished, that made Steele lean back and really look at the man beside him. Not just an old guy killing time, someone carrying weight. "How long you been coming here?" Steele asked. The man exhaled slowly. 53 years. Give or take. Steele blinked. 53 years. 53 years, the man repeated, his voice flat. "Same bench. Same time. Every morning I'm able." Steele felt a cold knot forming in his chest. "Why?" The old man turned his head slightly, meeting Steele's gaze for the first time, and in those pale blue eyes was a kind of grief that didn't fade with time. It just settled deeper. "Because I made a promise," the man said, "and I'm not the kind who breaks them." Steele opened his mouth to ask what kind of promise could hold a man to a bench for half a century, but before he could speak, the old man stood slowly, gripping his cane for balance. "You want to know the rest," the man said. "Come back tomorrow. I'll be here." And without another word, he turned and walked toward the parking lot, his steps careful and deliberate, leaving Steele sitting alone on the bench with 100 questions burning in his mind, and the certainty that whatever story this man carried, it was about to change everything Steele thought he understood about loyalty, loss, and the promises we make when we still believe the world is kind. Steele didn't sleep well that night. He'd ridden another 60 miles to a motel outside Missoula, finished the club meeting without saying much, and spent most of the evening staring at the ceiling while his mind kept circling back to the old man on the bench. 53 years. The same spot. Every morning. What kind of promise did that? By the time dawn broke, Steele was already on the road, his Harley cutting through the cold Montana air as he retraced his route back toward Riverside. He told himself he was just passing through, that stopping again didn't mean anything, but the truth settled heavier with every mile. He needed to know. The park was empty when he arrived, the morning mist still clinging to the grass. But as Steele killed the engine and climbed off his bike, he saw the familiar figure already seated on the bench, hands folded over the cane, eyes fixed on the river. Steele walked over slowly and sat down without asking this time. The old man glanced at him and nodded once, as if he'd been expecting it. "You came back," the man said. "Yeah. Most people don't." Steele didn't answer. He just waited. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he sighed and spoke, his voice low and steady, like he'd told this story to himself 1,000 times, but never out loud. "Her name was Claire," he said. "We met when we were 18, right here in Riverside. She worked at the diner on Main Street, and I was just a kid trying to figure out what to do with my life." He paused, a faint smile touching his lips. She had a laugh that could stop traffic. Steele listened, saying nothing. "We got married young. Too young, people said. But we didn't care. We were going to build a life together, house, kids, the whole thing." His voice faltered slightly. "And we did. For a while." The old man's hands tightened on the cane. "Then the war came. Vietnam. I got drafted in '68, and I told her I'd be back. Told her we'd pick up right where we left off. She didn't want me to go, but I didn't have a choice." Steele's chest tightened. "Before I shipped out, we came here. To this bench. It was our spot. We used to sit here on weekends and watch the river." He swallowed hard. "She made me promise that when I came home, I'd meet her here. First thing. Before anything else." Steele felt the weight of those words settle over him like snow. "I got wounded 6 months into my tour. Shrapnel in my leg. Spent 3 months in a hospital in Saigon. Then got sent home early." The man's voice cracked slightly. "I wrote her letters every week. Told her I was coming back. Told her to wait for me." He stopped, and for a long moment, the only sound was the river moving quietly beyond the trees. "She never got those letters," he whispered. "Because she was already gone." Steele's jaw tightened. "Car accident. 2 weeks before I came home. Drunk driver ran a red light downtown." The old man's voice was hollow now. "She died instantly. I didn't find out until I landed stateside and called her parents." Steele closed his eyes. "I came here the next morning, to the bench, because I'd promised." The man's hands trembled slightly on the cane, and I realized she'd kept her promise too. She'd been waiting, just like she said she would. Steele opened his mouth, but no words came. "So I kept coming," the man continued. "Every morning. Because even though she's gone, I made a promise. And maybe," his voice broke, "maybe if I keep showing up, it means she didn't wait alone." The silence that followed was enormous. Steele stared at the river, his throat tight, his mind struggling to process the depth of what he'd just heard. 53 years of grief. 53 years of faithfulness to a woman who would never sit beside him again. Finally, Steele spoke, his voice rough. "What's your name?" "Robert. Robert Hayes." Steele nodded slowly. "I'm Steele." Robert glanced at him. "You ride with the angels?" "Yeah." "Ever made a promise you couldn't keep?" The question hit harder than Steele expected. He thought of brothers he'd lost. That's unpaid. Words spoken and forgotten. "Yeah," Steele admitted quietly. "More than I'd like to count." Robert turned back toward the river. "Then you understand." And in that moment, Steele did. Steele sat beside Robert Hayes on that bench for another hour. Neither of them speaking much, just sharing the quiet weight of memory and the strange comfort of not being alone in it. When Steele finally stood to leave, he shook Robert's hand, rough, weathered, but steady, and rode out of Riverside with something heavy sitting in his chest that he couldn't quite name. But he came back the next week, and the week after that. At first, Steele told himself he was just passing through, but the truth was harder to ignore. Robert Hayes had gotten under his skin. The kind of loyalty that man carried, the kind that didn't demand anything in return, didn't expect recognition or reward, was something Steele had spent his whole life chasing in the brotherhood of the road. And here it was, sitting quietly on a bench beside a river most people never noticed. The conversation started slow. Robert would talk about Claire, small things, like the way she hummed while doing dishes or how she always wore yellow on Sundays. Steele would listen, and sometimes he'd talk too, about the brothers he'd lost, the roads that didn't lead anywhere, the weight of carrying a patch that people feared but never understood. And somewhere in those mornings, something shifted. Steele started bringing coffee. 2 cups. Robert never asked for it, but he always took it with a quiet nod of thanks. Then one morning, Steele showed up, and Robert wasn't there. Panic hit fast. Steele walked the park twice, checked the parking lot, even knocked on doors at nearby houses asking if anyone had seen the old man. Nothing. Finally, a woman at the corner store told him Robert had been taken to the hospital 2 days earlier. Heart trouble, she thought. Steele was on his bike and halfway to Riverside General before he even realized he'd made the decision. He found Robert in a pale green room on the 3rd floor, hooked to monitors that beeped softly in the quiet. The old man looked smaller in the hospital bed, frilier, but his eyes were still sharp when Steele walked in. "Didn't think you'd come," Robert said, his voice thin. "Yeah, well." Steele pulled a chair close. "Somebody's got to make sure you don't skip out on our meetings." Robert smiled faintly. "Doctors say my heart's giving up." Steele's jaw tightened. "How long?" "Weeks. Maybe less." The silence stretched. "I'm not going to make it back to the bench," Robert said quietly. "Not like before." Steele leaned forward. "Then we bring the bench to you." Robert blinked. "What? You kept a promise for 53 years. You don't break it now." 2 days later, Steele and 6 brothers from the Hells Angels chapter rode into Riverside with a truck, tools, and a plan that sounded insane but felt exactly right. They pulled the bench, Robert and Claire's bench, straight out of the park, loaded it carefully, and drove it to the hospital. The staff tried to stop them at first, but Steele's calm insistence and the sight of 7 bikers refusing to leave until they'd finished what they came to do made the argument short. They set the bench outside Robert's window, on a small patch of grass overlooking the parking lot. It wasn't the river. It wasn't perfect. But it was the bench. When Robert saw it through the glass, tears ran down his weathered face. Steele visited every morning after that, sitting on the bench outside the window where Robert could see him, sometimes talking through the glass, sometimes just being there. The old man's strength faded quickly, but his eyes stayed clear, and every morning he'd lift a hand in quiet acknowledgement. Robert Hayes passed 3 weeks later, peacefully, with the bench visible through the window, and Steele sitting on it like a silent guard. At the funeral, Steele stood in the back while the town said goodbye. Afterward, he went to the cemetery and found Claire's grave beside Robert's fresh plot. He placed a single rose on each, then walked away. The bench stayed outside the hospital for a month before Steele and his brothers moved it back to the park, bolting it down with a small bronze plaque that read, "Robert and Claire Hayes. Promises kept." Steele still stops there when he rides to Riverside. He sits for a while, drinks his coffee, and thinks about the old man who taught him that loyalty isn't loud. It doesn't roar. It just shows up, every morning, no matter how many years pass or how much it hurts. And sometimes, when the river's quiet and the light hits just right, Steele swears he can feel them both there, Robert and Claire, finally together on the bench where they were always meant to be.